Welcome to This Explainer. If you've ever felt like a breakup was literally tearing you apart, physically hurting you, well, you are not being dramatic. Today we are diving into the intense, agonizing experience of a broken heart. We're going to look at exactly what happens to the mind during a breakup, the very real science behind that pain, and most importantly, what incredible transformations can actually come from it. Here's our roadmap for today. First, the social breakdown. 2, the neurological crisis. 3, the ADHD amplifier. 4, the identity void. And 5, the path to growth. Let's get right into it.
So check out this staggering number, 72.9%. Research actually shows that up to 72.9% of heartbroken individuals score above clinical cutoffs for a probable PTSD diagnosis. I mean, that is significantly higher than even traditional trauma groups. It just goes to show, the distress of a romantic split isn't just some fleeting sadness. It is severely real, measurable trauma.
Which begs the question, right? Why does a purely social event make our actual physical bodies ache so much? Like, why do we feel it deep in our chest or our stomach or even our muscles? Well, it turns out our brains are uniquely wired for connection. And when that connection is suddenly severed, literally all the alarms go off. So let's deconstruct the scientific reality of rejection. Functional MRI scans reveal exactly why it hurts so bad. There's a region called the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, and it just lights up like a Christmas tree during romantic rejection. The crazy part? This is the exact same neural architecture that processes physical tissue damage, like, say, a severe burn injury. Emotional distress literally registers in your nervous system as actual physical injury. So no, your body isn't just making it up. It is processing real trauma. All right, Section 1, the social breakdown. Psychologist Steve Duck maps out this uncoupling process in his famous phase model. It usually starts with the intrapsychic phase. That's when one partner kind of hits their threshold of "I can't stand this anymore" and starts reflecting privately. Then we move to the dyadic phase, which brings the outward confrontation. Next up is the social phase. This is where the discontent goes public to friends and family, which frankly makes it a lot harder to repair. And finally, we see the grave dressing phase, where both people construct a face-saving narrative to protect their social credit as they get ready for a new life.
Moving on to Section 2, the neurological crisis.
Look at the sheer contrast here. When you're in love, your love brain is just flooded with bonding and reward chemicals. We're talking high dopamine, high oxytocin. But when that relationship ends, your breakup brain takes over, and it is a completely different story. Dopamine and oxytocin absolutely plummet. And at the exact same time, the amygdala, which is basically your brain's fire alarm, triggers a massive spike in stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Basically, your emotional regulation just goes completely offline.
So what does this all mean? It means your brain is thrown into a literal addiction withdrawal state. Because that primary source of dopamine and oxytocin is suddenly gone, your brain desperately craves your former partner just to restore its chemical balance. It is identical to chemical substance addiction. This is exactly why you might find yourself obsessively checking their social media or, rereading old texts at 2 a.m. It is not a weakness, it's a literal neurobiological drive trying to survive a severe chemical crash. And beyond the brain, this registers deep, deep in the body. Sensing all this overwhelming grief and a major threat to attachment, your vagus nerve can actually force your body into what's called a dorsal vagal shutdown. Think of it as a state of physiological immobilization. This perfectly explains the heavy brain fog, that chronic exhaustion, the digestive issues, and just that profound numbness you feel when a relationship ends. Basically, your body is powering down to protect you from the pain.
Which brings us to Section 3, the ADHD amplifier.
Now, for those living with ADHD, a breakup is incredibly amplified by a phenomenon known as rejection sensitivity dysphoria, or RSD. See, because ADHD brains already struggle with dopamine dysregulation on a good day, this post-breakup dopamine drop, it's catastrophic. Reduced dopamine activity in the frontolimbic pathways makes negative feedback feel intensely agonizing. The amygdala goes into complete overdrive. The frontal cortex, which is the part that handles calm, rational thinking, just completely shuts offline, and the whole system is flooded with this overwhelming sense of shame.
Therapist Becky Stone, who specializes in neurodivergent emotional overwhelm, reminds us of something absolutely vital here. She says, "You are not broken, you're just wired to feel things deeply." This intense shame loop, the desperate attempts for control, which sometimes even manifest as disordered eating or extreme self-blame, it isn't a flaw.
It's a nervous system responding to a threat it simply cannot regulate. So if you're going through this, you aren't being dramatic or overreacting. Your brain is just wired for immense depth.
All right, Section 4, the identity void.
In healthy relationships, our identities naturally expand to include our partner. But because of this overlap, a breakup causes a severe contraction in what psychologists call self-concept clarity. Basically, this is the extent to which you perceive your own identity as stable, coherent, and clearly defined. When the relationship ends, that shared identity just crumbles, and it leaves behind this massive psychological identity void. It leaves you asking this incredibly painful question: who am I without you? And that question really represents that crumbling sense of self. Research actually shows that this specific loss of self-concept clarity is the primary driver of post-breakup depressive symptoms. Interestingly, psychophysiological data even shows that people who involuntarily furrow their brow, activating what's called the corrugator supercilium muscle when thinking of their ex, well, they actually show significantly poorer recovery of their identity over time. Literally, the body holds on to the loss of the self.
Let's pivot now to Section 5, the path to growth.
The difference between chronic distress and profound growth ultimately comes down to how we think. The key to healing is shifting away from intrusive rumination, that automatic, involuntary reliving of painful memories that just keeps the amygdala firing on all cylinders. Instead, we have to move toward deliberate rumination. This is a purposeful, conscious effort to reflect, analyze the event, and actually make meaning out of the loss.
But to make that shift, we actually have to start with the nervous system. Because, let's be real, you can't just think your way out of a biological crisis. So here are the steps to heal. First, regulate the body. Use breath work or even cold water exposure to pull yourself out of that dorsal vagal shutdown. Second, especially if you have ADHD, consciously separate the true facts from the lies that RSD and shame are telling you. Write them down if you have to. Third, interrupt that shame loop by setting strict time limits on your spiraling thoughts. And finally, engage in deliberate disclosure. Talk to a supportive social network to start reconstructing your own narrative. As your nervous system finally starts to calm down, you can begin to rebuild your self-concept clarity and reclaim your neglected self. This requires actively sorting through your traits. You deliberately discard the attributes you only adopted because of your ex-partner's influence, and you purposefully retain the traits that truly belong to your authentic self. It's really all about filling that identity void with your own self-compassionate truth.
And this brings us to the final phase of Steve Duck's model, a phase he actually added years later called the resurrection phase. This is where we finally move beyond the agonizing withdrawal and that intense identity loss. We redefine who we are, we learn from the past, and we actually emerge stronger, experiencing measurable, profound personal growth.
Your pain is incredibly real. It is a biological, chemical, and psychological trauma completely validated by science. But now that you understand the exact mechanics of heartbreak, what actually happens to your mind and body, you also have the blueprint to heal. So, I'm going to leave you with this final thought for your recovery journey. Knowing that the slate has been wiped clean, what new identity will you build in your own resurrection phase?